Hi, my name's Debs Hollingsworth, and this is a presentation about the senses, sensory lives, and an inspirational woman called Joanna Grace. I was recently invited to be a speaker at a local event for International Women's Day taking place in Hyams Park in London, where I live. It was a real honour to be invited to speak at an event to some wonderful women and people about a topic that I'm truly passionate about. The theme of the evening was Include to Inspire. I couldn't believe that I was invited. I had to pinch myself to make sure I could believe it was true. Let me ask you to do that now too. Give yourselves a little pinch on the back of your hand. Did you do it? Could you feel it? I'll come back to that in a little while. So, include to inspire. Inclusion. What do you think of when you hear that word, inclusion? For me, my first response to the word inclusion is not race, gender, sexuality, skin colour, religion, age, culture, heritage. For me, inclusion relates to special educational needs and disabilities. I'm a SENCO, a Special Educational Needs and Disabilities Coordinator. I am particularly interested in and professionally invested in the inclusion of those with physical or neurological individualities within our education system. Around 17% of children in England's schools are registered as having SEND, and according to the SEND Code of Practice, there are 4 broad areas of need: cognition and learning, communication and interaction, social emotional mental health, sensory and or physical needs. This presentation focuses mostly on 2 of those categories: communication and interaction, sensory and or physical needs. So the senses. How many senses do we have? Think about it. How many senses do we have? 5, right? Most people, when asked that question, will say 5 because that is what we learned in school. I asked my teenage children, how many senses do we have? They said 5 because that is what they have learned in school. But this is actually and factually incorrect. The study of the brain, of neurology, of biology, of our nervous system, neurobiology, has advanced significantly. There are currently commonly accepted to be at least 8 senses, but I am very recently persuaded to accept and acknowledge at least 9. Some neurobiologists argue that there are over 20 senses, but that is a bit beyond me, so I'm going to go with 9 today. 9 senses. So what are the 5 that we all usually will acknowledge as our 5 senses? Vision, hearing, smell, touch, taste. Got those wrong. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the less well-known senses today. So during the presentation that I gave at the local event, I did do a little bit of audience participation, but through a video screen that's slightly difficult. Ask yourself this: do you practice yoga? Do you know anyone who practices yoga? If so, you or they are likely to have advanced vestibular sensory processing. Vestibular. Balance. Do you practice sport? Think about how you feel when you complete a long run or a long swim or a good game. Accelerated heartbeat, feeling your pulses, hot and sweaty, aching muscles, hunger and thirst. You're aware of all of that thanks to your interoception. Interoception, the awareness of our internal organs. Now just have a little look around you. Can you see something that you can reach for at arm's length? Stay looking towards the screen, don't look towards it, reach and pick it up. You're able to do that courtesy of your proprioception, your awareness of your body and your limbs in space. It's thanks to proprioception that you can be really engaged in a conversation and maintaining eye contact and then reach for that drink and have a sip. And remember back to when I asked you to give yourself a little pinch. Did you feel it? That is the ninth sense that I'm referring to today, and it's the one that I've only recently acknowledged and accepted as a sense in and of itself, the sense of pain. That is the feeling of pain or the anticipation of pain. So these are our 9 senses as I understand them today. But ask me again in a year's time and I might be able to tell you of more. So there are a minimum of 9 senses, and therefore there are multiple possibilities for sensory enjoyment, sensory engagement, sensory awareness, sensory experiences. There are also many possibilities for sensory impairment or sensory misfunction. I'd now like to talk about an inspirational woman, Joanna Grace of the Sensory Project. I first came across Joanna Grace when I moved from secondary mainstream teaching to a specialist setting. After 15 years at secondary mainstream, I changed role to work in a local special school for children who are blind and visually impaired, and many of whom have other additional complex needs. And then I subsequently was fortunate enough to manage a resourced provision within a secondary mainstream school for children with more profound and multiple learning disabilities, or as I prefer it, diff abilities. Joanna Grace is a PhD student, an author, a speaker, a teacher. She is a mother. She is autistic. She describes herself as a sensory engagement and inclusion specialist. She also describes herself as a linguistic being. Using her definition, I presume that anybody watching this video is also a linguistic being. That is to say that we have language. Our primary method of communicating is with and via words. We talk, we listen, we read, we write. This evening or today I am presenting verbally, and your processing is auditory. Joanna Grace is the founder of the Sensory Projects, which has a website tagline, seeking to contribute to a world where everyone is understood in spite of difference. She's authored 2 books, Sensory Stories and Sensory Beings. Joanna Grace has shared with the world the following definitions. Linguistic being. A person who has acquired and uses language to frame and experience meaning. Sensory being. A person whose primary experience of life and meaning within it is sensory. We are all sensory, but the distinction here is regarding an individual's capacity to process, understand and use language. Sensory beings are limited or extremely limited in their capacity to process, to understand, to use and to articulate words and narratives. Their experience of life is mainly through how they feel, what they feel, and through their response to sensations. A sensory being is likely to be someone described within the education sector as having profound and multiple learning disabilities or profound and multiple learning difficulties. A learning difficulty is distinct from a learning disability. Learning difficulties include dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, dyspraxia. These are conditions that pose barriers to learning but do not impair cognitive function and ability. A learning disability has a permanent and lifelong impact on an individual's ability to learn and their cognitive function. People can be born as sensory beings. Neurological disorders, Rett syndrome, Barren disease, in some cases autism or Down syndrome, for example. People can become sensory, catastrophic brain injury or late-stage dementia, for example. And some linguistic but profoundly disabled people experience life through a sensory lens, paraplegia or cerebral palsy. There are phenomenally complex layers and blurs. Sensory beings require a high level of care, in many cases round-the-clock support with all aspects of functional life: eating, drinking, dressing, moving, medication, personal care. There will be a team around every individual. Able-bodied and linguistic beings like myself rarely have the opportunity to share our spaces and our experiences with sensory beings because our busy modern world does not facilitate it. And when we do, with the mobility aids and medical paraphernalia and supporting adults that invariably surround them, it can be a default setting to experience sadness or pity. But early on in my move to specialist education, Joanna Grace taught me that to be truly empathetic and inclusive is to refute and reject pity. I believe that pity erodes life, she said during a TEDx talk entitled For Pity's Sake, as she shared the stage and the experience with Chloe Southfield, a sensory being. My lack of pity does not stem from a lack of understanding, she said. My lack of pity is down to its lack of utility. It has no use in breaking down the barriers to inclusion. We tend to think of inclusion as physical things and the barriers to that. So we think of ramp access or hearing aids or braille or wheelchairs or disabled toilets or physical things. But Joanna Grace states the real barriers to inclusion are those of understanding and awareness. A person's ability to communicate does not depend on the mastery of certain skills, but on our ability to listen. I am so grateful that I learned this. It literally changed my life. I learned that I could not only include to inspire, but be inspired by stepping into the lives of those whose experience of life is sensory. Some of my most meaningful moments in education, my most impactful instances of connection, have been those spent with sensory beings, with children who are among the most vulnerable and disabled or differently abled in our education system. Joanna Grace inspired me. And through her, I learned the art of sensory stories. Sensory stories are short stories, typically 8 to 10 sentences, and each sentence is delivered with an accompanying sensory experience. They can be regularly repeated to build up anticipation, participation, and response, connection. It was an absolute joy to bring to life classic stories in a few short sentences and some huge sensory experiences. Roald Dahl stories, for example, George's Marvellous Medicine, Fantastic Mr. Fox, the BFG, and also doing some work around Peter and the Wolf. In delivering a sensory story, we necessarily set aside the stress of our modern life and our linguistic expectations and communications. We focus on the moment. We become mindful and attuned in the truest sense. We process empathetically the reaction and responses of others. It's a truly moving and humbling encounter. Now, I have amassed a slightly embarrassing number of props and tools, and many local people contributed to that, as I was often known to put out a call for, has anyone got some fabric or this toy or that tool? And I would also think about stimulating where safe and practical to do so, those other senses, the vestibular, the proprioceptive and the interoceptive senses, by means of body positioning, movement and pressure. I cannot even explain the thrill of the moments that I shared. Obviously, I cannot use names. Child A, a gorgeous princess of a girl, glowing smile, luscious locks of hair, entirely uncomplaining, always alert for engagement and interaction, non-speaking and extensively disabled. She would howl like a wolf when she saw the mask that signified, as an object of reference, the start of Peter and the Wolf sessions. She was in year 10, and no one had ever heard her make such a fabulous, joyful, expressive vocalisation. It was utterly fabulous. I later won a huge, giant toy wolf in a very local raffle, and I took it into where I worked, and her morning engagement with that daily, almost daily, really brought us great pleasure. Child B, such a cheeky chappy, huge grin, even bigger personality, always insisted on being the centre of the attention. Down syndrome, autism, wheelchair user. He learned to shake his shaker with gusto to replicate the gunshot when poor fantastic Mr. Fox lost his tail. He later played the part of Peter in our little production of Peter and the Wolf, and his physicality exceeded all of our expectations. Child C, a very reserved, calm and gentle child that I interacted with mostly one-to-one in the sensory room, responded with wide eyes and genuine awe at the sensation of drips from a pipette dropped on her cheek to simulate tears, or the sound of the bird from Peter and the Wolf. She later turned her head away when I introduced the stinky manure cube. Oh, quite right too. It is utterly disgusting. But this was really astonishing progress, and a moment I will never forget. A real communication, true connection. Joanna Grace has said that mindfulness is the non-judgmental attention to the present. And in the population of sensory beings, we meet people who lead constant lives of non-judgmental attention to the present. And I am forever grateful for the opportunities that I have had to share intensive interactions and moments of joy and connection with some of those people. I'm grateful to Joanna Grace and her work for what I learned from that. And I'm very grateful if you have listened to this presentation. Thanks very much.